Hello and welcome everyone. This is the EN Beyond WCAG results from the 4th of February in Dublin workshop webinar, very long title. My name is Susanna Lorin. I'm the IAAP and G3ICT representative to the EU. And the housekeeping for today is that this webinar is recorded, so it will be possible to watch this again and again and again at the IAAP EU YouTube channel. And we have automatic captions for this webinar. And if you would like to ask a question, which we of course encourage, then please do use the Q&A function. I cannot guarantee that I will see your questions if it's in the chat, but if you do have any technical issues, then please post them in the chat and my colleague Peter will try to have control over that as well at the same time as we are speaking. We have disabled microphones and cameras just to avoid any distraction during this webinar. And this webinar is 1.5 hours long because we have more requirements than we usually have. So hopefully we will have a little bit more time also to discuss and ask questions. So the speakers of today is Peter Kemen, Shadi Abuzara, Jeroen Halscher, and I still can't say that name, so I will let him present himself in perfect Dutch, and Ditlev Fischer, and should have been also Malin Hammarberg. Unfortunately, she has still 40 degrees of fever and cannot be with us today, so I will try to present her part of this as well. So unfortunately, it won't be as engaged and fantastic as it usually is when Malin is speaking. But still, we have a very good lineup of facilitators who helped us during this workshop. The agenda for today is what we're doing right now, a little bit of welcome and housekeeping, and then I will do a short, brief intro about the background to this series of workshops. If you haven't heard us before or experienced these workshops yourself, then you want to explain what we are doing. And then we have the 5 presentations, and after each short presentation, there is a Q&A section. So you can ask your question using the Q&A function anytime, but they will be responded to after each of the presentations because there's a lot of details here and we don't want to challenge you cognitively, so you have to remember it to the end of the session. So the presentations will be on the following EN 301-549 requirements. 5.1.3.9, private access to personal data. 5.1.4, functionality closed to text enlargement. 5.5, tactilely discernible operable parts. 11.5.2.1, platform interoperability with assistive technologies. And 11.5.2.11, list of available actions. So now I think everyone remembers that by heart, but I wanted to tell you a little bit about the background of this. So all the EU laws on digital accessibility, all of them, 3 of them, they do point to EN standards, so the European standards that are European norms, and those standards, it's a little bit misleading to say requires here, but we cannot support these legislation with global standards like the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines directly, but we need a European standard that is harmonized, which means that it's voted on by the European standardization organizations and then adopted by the European Commission and published in something called the official journal. That means that it's a harmonized standard, and those standards can be used to support European legislation. And of course, the standards are only voluntary, so the actual requirements for accessibility are in the laws. But if you want to know a little bit more of how to do these things, or if you want to have support in what is called presumed conformance, so using a standard to feel more secure that you're doing the right thing, then it should be EN standards that you're meeting. And both in the Web Accessibility Directive and the European Accessibility Act, excuse me for all the abbreviations on the screen, both of them will be pointing to the EN 301-549. So the EN 301-549 is an old standard now in Europe. It was originally created to support the procurement directive, and then we developed it further to support the Web Accessibility Directive, which is the legislation that has been enforced in the EU since quite a while for public sector websites and apps. And now we're also updating the EN 301-549 currently to support the European Accessibility Act. So it will have different annexes after the next version is published, where you can see which requirements are relevant for the Web Accessibility Directive and which requirements are relevant for the European Accessibility Act, because there are different organizations or sectors that are in scope of these two legislations. And already in the current version of the EN, we have more than 60 requirements that are unique, if you will, to the EN 301-549, even if we do not talk about the hardware and the things that are kind of beyond the web and apps. So already now, even if you're only looking at the Web Accessibility Directive requirements and want to know what are the presumed conformance, the technical specifications, if you will, for websites and apps, then we have more than 60 requirements that do not have anything similar to what WCAG calls understanding documentation or techniques. And those documents are, of course, very, very helpful to understand what the standard actually means or the requirement actually mean. But those are not produced within the EN environment. So what does this mean? Well, it means that to be sure that you meet the EU legislation, the European legislation, you need to handle, no matter if you are a monitoring agency or if you are an accessibility expert supporting your clients, or if you are a public sector in scope of the legislation, you need to make sure that you meet all the requirements in this EN, and quite a few of them you get no real help in understanding and interpretation. This has led to fragmentation, which is the opposite of what standards and the laws are meant to provide, and also a lot of confusion around when these requirements are applicable, how to interpret them, and how to test. So that is not a good situation. And even more so because the member states of the EU, they have of course, seen this problem and started to create their own rules. So we now have not only fragmentation across the industry, but also from the enforcement side, where different member states interpret the requirements in different ways. And that was not the intention of this whole exercise. So what IAAP decided to do is to try something else, to say we need to go outside of the standardization world and see if we can share knowledge across sectors with different stakeholders and try to work together to see if we can get some kind of alignment here and help stopping this fragmentation. So in 2023, we initiated a series of workshops that we now have been doing twice or three times a year, where we work together with monitoring agencies, with market surveillance authorities, with accessibility experts, with our own members and other people from the community, of course, with end user organizations and organizations in scope of the legislation. And we work together to make sure that we understand what the standard means and how to interpret and test it. And during these years, we have also provided quite a lot of input to the standardization process. Now the EN 301-549 is in a stable version, so we can't make input anymore. But we also have had the editor of the EN 301-549 at our workshop, so he has also learned from the community, and that way we have also made sure that we could make an impact into the development of the new version of the EN. Our goal with this has always been some kind of official publication, and I still hope that we will be sometime in a position where we can publish the result of all of this inside of the framework of the standardization world. We haven't succeeded so far. We have had a little bit of a pushback, but at least what we have decided and what we are working on is really to have something that is free of charge, open to all, and not branded. So anything anyone learns from the workshops, or if you learn anything from the webinar today, all of this will be shared with everyone. It's public openly, and you can run with it, do whatever you like, and make sure to spread this as much as possible. It's really community-based idea. So I don't know if we have any questions for this, but can't see any questions. So. And we will send out to everyone that is registered for today, we will send out the documentation after the webinar. It's because of illness in the team, we haven't been able to do that yet, but you will get the documentation, so you don't need to write everything down today. And the workshops are facilitated by volunteers, so no one is paid to do this, but we have a great setup of volunteers. There's a slightly larger group than what is presented today, and anyone who has time and want to go to one of the workshops, because they are physical workshops often on site, adjacent to the European, the IAAP EU events. We facilitate each of us one group, and then we join forces together and present to the rest of the world. So that is where we are right now. So today we are going to present the interim results so far from the workshop that we held in Dublin on the 4th of February. And that was the day before we had a big IAAP EU event, and that event we have just started publishing the recordings from that event. So you can also, if you follow IAAP EU online on LinkedIn, then you can see, or at YouTube, you can see the recordings if you're interested in the actual event. So now we will start with Peter, who is going to present the results of the discussion on requirement 5.1.3.9, private access to personal data.
Yes, thank you, Susanna. So yeah, I will talk about the requirement privacy access to personal data. It is just to tell you where it is in the standard. It is in 5.1. That section is about closed functionality. So it deals with requirements when the user cannot attach their assistive technology to the ICT, to the device. And within that, it is in 5.1.3, which is non-visual access. So this requirement and others are about when there's an audio output that is provided to get non-visual access for mainly visual information. So that's good to know in advance. And this is about personal data and private access to that. So basically, you don't want the ATM shout out your name, your PIN code, the money amount you withdraw, so that everybody behind you in the line can hear it. And if you are a blind person and then you cannot see what's on the screen, so it has to be told somehow with an auditory output. So this requirement is about that. And thank you. It's a long requirement. It has two parts. And sorry, Susanna, I made it click heavy, so I will say click when you need to press a button. So the requirement has two parts. The first part is the prerequisites which have to be fulfilled, and the second part is what has to be fulfilled, and all requirements are like that. I'm not going through this. I'm not reading it out, so please click. But I highlight the parts of both prerequisites and the requirements. So it is about closed functionality where an auditory output is provided as an alternative for visual access, as I explained before. Please click. The important thing is that the ICT, let's say it's a self-service terminal, an ATM machine, is intended for public shared use, so it's out in the public, and click. And it has audio output, which contains private data. So if all that happens, then please click. The requirements are that this auditory output has to be delivered only through a mechanism for private listening, which can be a personal headset, it can be directional speakers or a speaker hood, which makes sure that only the person, the user, can hear it. It's very futuristic, but it's all mentioned in the standard. So it's a very, very future-proof standard in that sense. So the auditory output has to be delivered through this mechanism for private listening. Please click. And this mechanism or this auditory device should be connected without the user of vision. And please click. And there's an extra thing that it is also possible to offer other ways of listening, which is not private, but the user has to explicitly agree to that. Please click. So who is this important for? Obviously for persons without vision and for any privacy-related data and issues. And it also is important for users with limited vision and users with limited cognition. This is in the standard. Please click. But in our discussion, we said that it should also be mentioned that it's important for users with limited reach. So it's not enough to be able to connect this device without vision, but it should be within reach or easy to reach as well. So we think that it would be ideal to have that as a secondary user group. Please click. So what is the problem? The first one, please click, is that it mentions personal data. And in our discussion, we realized that it doesn't necessarily mean what we would think. It doesn't involve the amount you withdraw or your account number, maybe. It doesn't include your PIN code. So it is data that identifies you and that's related to a person and sensitive. So maybe it would be good to extend that to confidential data. And truth be told, a note mentions that actually it's a good practice not to speak out loud information that would help identify the person and that others could follow them and rob them. It's a very dark picture the requirement paints, but it is a realistic scenario if you take out money from an ATM. But it's still just a recommendation, and we think it's not enough. So the next one is that it is heavily based on privacy policy. So personal data that is defined in privacy policy. So, but if there's no privacy policy, there's no protection. Next. Another issue is it is specifically about when the machine is pronouncing private data. So what happens if there's a private data and then the rest of the text is non-private data? Will it switch between your headphone and the speakers? Because that's acceptable, that's not a feasible solution that should be avoided. Maybe to mention that in a note. Next, please. Then there's the other thing that it says, the requirement says that the device can be connected without requiring the use of vision. So there are limits to finding that possibility, and I'll have a slide about that specifically. Next one is that access with limited reach, which I mentioned already, it should be mentioned. And the next is that the requirement finishes with any other mechanism explicitly chosen. So that might provide the loophole to get out of this issue. Next one, or the last problem mentioned here, is that for testing, because it's based on privacy policy, then the tester would need the privacy policy. And actually the user should know as well what is the privacy policy to know what would be data that he can or she can listen to with their own device. And also for testing, it would be necessary to identify when private data is mentioned in the process. So please, next. Can be connected without use of vision. It means that someone has to be able to find without the vision the jack plug for the headphones, for example, but it goes beyond that. Here is an example on the next slide, or next click. It's a parcel locker, and let's say that the audio jack is on the side of the locker. if it's not explained, then the person would need to feel the whole locker to find that jack, even if it's then perfectly detectable if you are there. This is not hygienic and is not acceptable at all. So that should not pass the requirement if it's located like that. And the next one is if it's a bigger locker and it explains that you have the jack on the side, but it's 3 meters away. I don't carry with myself a headphone that has a 3 meter cable. So those things, those little details should be at least addressed in a note. And the last slide, but also clicking through a pass and fail example. So if I have no listening device with me and I don't connect it, then I can still get the private data if it's spoken with my explicit. No, I cannot get the data only if I explicitly agree. So that's a pass. The next pass would be at if the requirements are followed, but the person doesn't have a listening device, so private listening device, so cannot connect, that should still be a pass. So it doesn't require that a headphone is provided for the user. And 3 fail examples. If there's no possibility to connect, but I can listen to the output out loud, if I explicitly agree with that, then I have a choice between not using the service and sharing my personal data. That's not acceptable. That should be a fail. And also the cases I mentioned, please click when the audio connection cannot be identified or if it is too far away. So that's as far as we got while discussing. Any questions on that?
Yes, sorry, I couldn't find my talking about finding things. I couldn't get to my microphone button. So we do have a more a question on the favorite one, 11.7, which we're not discussing today, but that we have actually discussed in 2 other workshops and webinars. So the list of settings of under requirement 11.7 user preferences, that's everyone's favorite. That the units of measurements on color, contrast, font type, font size, and focus cursor. The question is this a list of examples or exactly those settings, anything more? And we have discussed that at length. And I think we are all in agreement, or at least the people have been on the workshops, that this cannot be a list of everything. It must be examples, but maybe that should be more clearly defined. And there is also many other discussions around 11.7. So please follow the discussions on that and read all our documentation on 11.7 because there's many other interesting parts of that. And then in the chat, please do use the Q&A because it's much easier for me, but I will try to read from the chat as well. So 3 questions. So yes, probably we will at least have time for the first one. If I do not care about it because I forgot my headphones and I want to press on 5, normally it was possible to make it work, but apparently it's not the case anymore or not everywhere. I don't know if that is a question, but do you understand that, Peter?
Yes, I think so. So I mentioned that we think that if you don't have your headset and you decide to listen it out loud, that would be passing the requirement. If there's a practice that option disappears, then that's not good. But it doesn't actually go against the requirement, I think, because the or other method is optional. I can take. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead. I can take the other ones. I read the question. If I can take
The
one
idea
more,
is
or we have
that
not.
I read them and you respond. I think
Okay.
that's what we are having. So the second question is: it's connected to the jack plug, and it a connected that disappears connection that disappears. Do you have a solution about that? So I don't know if that's a.
I think it's about the old discussion that a 3.5 millimeter track is kind of an old technology, but still the standard mentions that because that's a safe way to connect to the machine. So for an ATM, usually the operators want to avoid any other possible connection because it's a security risk. So USB, for example, or USB-C or Bluetooth. So it shouldn't go disappearing.
And the third question is, my friend told me that in Spain you have just to scan a QR code and do the actions in your own phone instead of the machine. And of course, the money will get out in the end from the machine. Well, that would be cool if it came from the phone. Is it also thought of being a generalized in Europe?
Actually, I've had a discussion about that in Dublin. And yes, it's a pilot project, as I understood. You still have to enter your PIN on the machine. So this requirement is still can be still relevant. Uh, mm, I have no information if that will be a general practice, but it might be the future.
But there is at least nothing in the standards that is working in that direction. So I think
No.
that should be a no answer for that. Um, and I forgot to say in the beginning that during this workshop that we had in Dublin in the beginning of February, we tried to focus on requirements that are not only relevant for the Web Accessibility Directive, which was kind of the original path we were going, but also extending to requirements that will be maybe more in focus when we start looking more into the European Accessibility Act, where we have all these self-service terminals and other kind of a broader scope than only the web and apps. So I think the rest was just comments. So anything else? Oh, we have people. Let's see if we can. Somebody wants to say something. So Robert Andersson. So I will give you the possibility to. You have raised your hand, so I guess you would like to say something, and now you can open your microphone and ask. You have to activate your microphone, but I have given you permission to activate, so you can just activate your microphone, and it looks like it's open now. So if you have a question, please ask it. But we do not hear you.
Meanwhile,
No,
have
it
this
doesn't seem
lowered
to work really. But maybe Peter, you can try to reach Robert in
the chat.
in the chat or something, so we go on. So thank you very much, Peter, for that presentation. And now we will go to Shadi. 514, functionality closed to text enlargement.
Hi, everyone. First of all, big thanks to Margarita Sibilia and Abby James, who took amazing notes during the workshop and summarized it all. So all I have to do is just read it out loud. Made it easy on me. Thank you. Yeah, the requirement, I will try to read it out loud. So let me take a deep breath. So the requirement reads, where ICT includes closed functionality and any functionality of the ICT is close to text enlargement features of platform or assistive technology, the ICT shall provide a mode of operation where the text and images of images of text necessary for all functionality is displayed in such a way that the X height of the text is at least 16 CSS pixels. And then there are three notes. Note 1, the formula for calculating the physical X height in millimeters from the X height in CSS pixels, and the distance in millimeters from the eye to the font is X height in millimeters is equal to D for distance in millimeters multiplied by CSS pixels divided by 2690. Note 2, this is the smallest font size, not the recommended font size for body text, which should be larger. And note 3, for handheld devices D, the distance should be assumed as 400 millimeters. Okay, everybody understood that, of course, a very easy requirement, but it has the same way of writing as Peter was listing. So there's a so-called precondition, what this applies to, and then what the requirements, what needs to be fulfilled. So the earlier part before the comma, where ICT includes closed functionality, etc., that is the precondition, and then the ICT shall provide a mode of operation is the actual what has to be fulfilled. And you see that way of writing in most of the requirements in the EN. Let's move on to the next slide. So who is this important for? That's the easy part, right? Currently was listed usage with limited vision as the primary, and there was large agreement on that during the workshop. It's primarily for people with different kinds of limited vision. You forgot your glasses, or many people with reduced visual acuity that don't actually use assistive technology. So in these cases, but in the workshop, it also came out some additional suggestions. For example, people with limited reach might be supported by having larger text, because it's assumed that would make links and other things maybe also bigger. People with limited manipulation and strength, also with the same purpose, or similar purpose, would create a larger click area if you have touch screen or something. People with limited cognition or with neurodivergence is because larger text is sometimes easier to read. For example, people with dyslexia or other kind of reading disabilities. And also people with limited hearing or without hearing, for whom maybe written language text is not the primary language. And so again, making text bigger might be easier to read. So these were additional user groups that a secondary that came up during the workshop. Then moving on, the more fun part is, what is the problem? And I don't know how much time we have. Actually, I do. We don't have enough time to go through all of them in detail, but let me give you a bit of a taste of what came out. First of all, when is it relevant? And kind of, it's clear that this is things like, let's say, an ATM or a machine or something, or maybe even a television. But then it starts getting a bit more interesting when you think about the different kinds of devices. We talked about, let's say, glasses, smart glasses or something. Now, that's not really a handheld device. What is the distance here? What is the distance to the eye? We also talked about things with mixed closed and open functionality. So imagine, let's say you have a video player and the assistive technology can access everything around the video player, but not the actual content for copyright reasons or something. What about the captions playing in this video? Are they part of the video or part of the functionality? What about a book reader, for example, for the same reason that the actual content of the book is not directly accessed by assistive technology? What happens? So it starts getting more interesting when we start looking at these kind of devices and products that have interesting functionality. That brought us to the next question, which, does it refer to closed functionality only? What is the expected behavior? There's a lot of detail here, but the requirement says when any functionality is closed to assistive technology or the assistive features, then all other text has to meet that. So for open functionality, there's a requirement that is derived from WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, that there is no actually minimum text size, but the text size should be doubled. So let's say, again, back to the situation where you have, let's say, for security reasons, the PIN code is not directly accessed by assistive technology, but the form surrounding that is, that would be addressed by the assistive technology, and the requirement is primarily intended for that part that is not supported by assistive technology, but you need to actually test all the rest of the content to make sure it meets that minimum font size as well. So that was a bit interesting here. And then a very interesting piece here is how is actually the font size really defined and measured? There's a couple of things that came up. First of all, the X height itself is the lower character X, we assumed. That's how it's defined, for example, on Wikipedia or other sources, but it's not actually really written down in the standard that it's the lower case X. It would make a big difference if you take the lowercase or the larger case X. It would also make a difference what kind of font you're using. Different fonts might have different X heights from the start, but then also the CSS calculation also in a way depends on the resolution of the screen. So there are many factors here that come into play. And again, we also came back to kind of other ways of not classical screens, like smart glasses, for example, but also say holograms or something, or AR and VR. How do these things really work in terms of CSS pixels, but also in terms of distance, and how is that measured? A little bit more detail, we started then digging into, okay, what's the exact definition of text enlargement features of platform or assistive technology? We basically understand what it means, magnification, but again, there can be very exotic, interesting. So one person said, what if the machine has actually a physical lens, magnifying lens on that. Imagine an ATM that has a physical magnifying lens that you could pull in front of the screen. Is that a text enlargement feature? Does that fall under the definition? So got into kind of interesting things, but also within the requirement, there's the mode of operation, and that brought some interesting discussions as well. What exactly would that mean, or what kind of scenarios could emerge from that? For example, one of the examples that were brought up was you have a supermarket self-checkout kiosk or screen, and on that there is information that is directly relevant to your purchase. What products you have, how much they cost, the total, etc. But then there might be like very small numbers at the bottom of that screen that is actually not intended for the customer at all. These are for, say, maintenance reasons, or if something occurs, the person managing the machine comes and checks these numbers or whatever. So these are not really customer-facing numbers. These are maintenance numbers. Would these need to be enlarged as well? And if not, it's a slippery slope. You start then deciding, okay, what's important for customers to see and what not. You start getting to questions like, well, what if it's an ad? You can say, well, that's not really important, but maybe it is. Maybe somebody wants to see an ad. So finding a delineation between what's relevant or what's quote unquote important and not kind of gets, is an interesting question, because the issue is on many screens you might have limited real estate, and making everything larger would mean maybe more scrolling, have to break things up into more screens. Where is here a sensible compromise? And then also in terms of consistency. So if you switch to a mode with larger text and suddenly that changes your interface to have multiple screens, makes the form longer, etc., it might be considered a different UI, and you get then into the kind of like the consistency issue with the rest of the ICT. So these are some of the details we discussed about the requirement itself. And then next slide, we got into the pass and fail examples. We didn't actually we didn't really end up with specific pass and fail, but we talked about all the issues with testing for this requirement because it's really quite complex. So I mentioned earlier We assume that it applies to lowercase x, but that's not really explicitly written. What happens if there is no x on the screen, or everything that you have on the screen is in uppercase? So you'd assume, of course, in testing that you could create some kind of a test screen, but let's say you're a third-party tester and you're coming to a machine and you don't have a way to actually generate an X somehow. That could occur. Then there's also text. It's very focused on text and images of text, but it doesn't actually refer to things like icons or meaningful icons. So there are some limitations here as well. And then I mentioned earlier the minimum distance of 40 millimeters, 400 millimeters, sorry, so 40 centimeters. That's typically the reading distance of like a mobile phone or an e-reader or something. But again, wearables or smart glasses or things like that, might not apply to any of these measures. Yeah, and mode of operation we just discussed. And then one more slide, last slide, is the test procedure actually has to be done in person on screen. So you actually walk up to the screen, you measure the height of the X on the screen, and you need to know the assumed viewing distance, the typical viewing distance, which can be tricky as well. Sometimes they're known for devices, or there's kind of like general practice for, say, things like a television or something. But sometimes it can get a bit more tricky to understand what is really typical viewing distance, overhead signage or things like that. What is really typical viewing distance? Sometimes you can get closer to things, look at them more closely. Sometimes you cannot. So maybe some guidance around that would be helpful. Was the a discussion in the group. And then I mentioned also the X height actually depends on the type of font selected, and viewing distance is not defined. So lots of questions that came up, more than answers, but it was a very engaged workshop. And again, thank you for all the participants there.
Thank you very much, Shadi. So we have a little bit of time for questions. We got a general question. Are there the presented slides already available for download? No, because they were just compiled like 5 seconds before the webinar. But we are sharing the documentation, which is much more, it's a written document on all of this. So you will not get the slides, but you will get the full documentation of kind of the notes from the workshop groups. And then we have a question for you, Shadi, here. Do you specify any font types or styles, as well as the size due to font type can impact or hinder neurodiverse individuals? That's not really in the standard, but maybe you have a comment.
Let me see if I understood that correctly. So I don't define anything, but the requirement doesn't talk about any particular font style or font type. It doesn't even say like, the default testing or something, or even font families like Arial or whatever. It just says the X height. That's as far as it goes.
Yeah. And in the chat, there also has been a discussion on how you measure that and how so there's comments on that, the way of measuring the X height and so on. And then another question is for the secondary group of people with limited cognition and the thought that larger text is easier. Was that based only on learning or reading disabilities, or groups with other cognitive impairments?
We didn't go down an exhaustive list, but yes, we started with dyslexia, but we started then thinking about other kinds of reading disabilities and how larger font helps many users, and so we then stopped there after we picked up a couple of examples, but we didn't do an exhaustive list. So I'm sure there's even more people that might benefit from that. But again, the groupings in the EN 301549 are very broad, so limited, actually, limited reach, limited manipulation strength, and then there's this whole pile cognitive, and everything falls under there. And so, yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of groups that are affected by that, but it all fits into cognitive under that umbrella term.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much, Shadi. And now I think I need to go to myself, which is a bit boring. But so because Malin Hammarberg, who led this discussion, she has a flu or something similar, so he has a high temperature and cannot be with us today. So I will try to do my best to report on her behalf. But if you have detailed questions, then please do write them, so that we will be able to ask her to respond to them afterwards, because I wasn't part of this group, so I can't really tell you more details than the ones I have. So the requirement is where ICT includes functionality that requires manual operation and control. The ICT shall provide a mode of operation that allows all the functionality of the ICT that requires manual operation and control to be controlled without requiring vision, using only tactilely discernible operable parts. So, and I have done the bold things here to remember where to do the stress. So that's not original in the requirement. But really, it means that ICT that has manual operation must be fully possible to operable without vision, using only things you can touch. At least that is how I read that. And then there are two notes. So note 1, as noted in the definition of tactilely discernible operable part, a touchscreen or touchpad that can be tactilely discerned, or a part of a touchscreen that is located adjacent to a tactilely discernible edge, corner, or tactile marking on a screen frame, is a tactilely discernible operable part. So, if there is a screen or an edge or something that can be detected by touch, so that is considered tactilely discernible. And note 2, where physical buttons are arranged in small functional groups, or on-screen buttons are positioned in fixed positions adjacent to a tactilely discernible boundaries, such as screen edges or surrounds, their position can be tactilely discerned. So it's not only the button or thing itself, but also if the thing you're supposed to press is close to something that you can touch or understand just without vision, then that should be considered also tactilely discernible. It's a bit funny that I have to say this, because both tactilely and discernible is really hard for me to say. But anyway, this is the requirement. And then it also, there are a lot of definitions in other parts of the standard. So it's actually even longer if you want to read all of it. But this is the requirement, including the notes. So if we look at who this is important for, according to the current version of the standard, and also the draft one, is the primary user groups are users without vision and users with limited vision, which is kind of obvious because it's also even says in the requirement that this is about without vision. And there are also secondary user groups, which are users with limited manipulation or strength, and also users with limited cognition. And during the workshop, the group didn't have any objections to this, and also no additions. And usually in these working group sessions or the workshop sessions, we add more user groups that we find relevant. But here the group said that that's fine. So well done, standardization people. We are happy with this. And when is this relevant? Well, it's interesting because the manual operation includes, of course, physical buttons, but also touch screen gestures and card or coin slots, and also many other things. So it's much broader than just keys. And here we show a couple of different touch screens and keypads and self-service terminals of different kinds, and also some kind of airport terminal where you get your boarding pass and so on. So it's important to note also that the tactilely discernible parts, operable parts, must be possible to locate by touch, but without activating it. So if the only way you can understand where it is by pressing it, then it's already too late. And adjacent to this, of course, if you get any tactile or haptic feedback after pressing, that's also important because that's confirmation that you have actually done something. But that is another part of this is not part of this requirement because that's too late. So the user must be able to first locate and then decide if he or she wants to do something. So those are important things to have in mind when discussing this requirement as well. And what is the problem then with this requirement? Well, one of the things that the group discussed was whether every individual key must be discernible. So should you really be able to feel each of the key on a keyboard? And according to the group, the understanding was yes. Because if you only locate where the keyboard area is, that is not enough if you are on a touch screen. If you consider a kind of a full screen virtual keyboard, well, that's good to know where the keyboard is, but if I don't know where each letter is, then I can't use the keyboard anyway. So the group also discussed that this would be probably quite difficult to achieve in practice, and it seemed like no one had a really good example of where this works in practice today. So that's interesting. Another discussion they had was around the layout of the keypad and other layouts, of course, that is not addressed in this requirement. So if you have the order of the numbers on a keypad in a non-standard order, that wouldn't be detectable just by touching, probably because you have this raised 5 in the middle, but then it could be in any order, the rest of them, and that would not be detectable without vision. So that is not part of this requirement, and the question is it part of any other requirement or any other standard? Anyway, this is a real issue, and I just encountered this just the other week by being abroad somewhere, and really the whole keypad was upside down for me. And I'm not completely blind, but I'm visually impaired enough for that to be a real issue. So that I would love to see that more standardized across different machines. The third problem they discussed, or the area they discussed, were that what really tactilely discernible, what is the sufficient level or distance, or kind of what is sufficient, what is enough to be tactilely discernible? Because if there's a really small edge or frame, then it may be not enough, and it may be very individual what you can actually feel or detect. There was also a discussion on different other standards like the EN 1332 and ETSI ETR 345, which do address physical characteristics of keys and keypads and so on. But those are not referenced in this standard, and maybe it's not even relevant. I don't know this standard, so I can't say. But really, in general, the thought of this group was that for physical buttons, the requirement is rather straightforward, even though the actual level and distance is not defined. But for touchscreens, it seems considerably harder to both test and enforce this, because how do you actually define what is tactilely discernible? What is a reference point that is undefined in practice? So the idea with a frame, of course, you have the corners. Those are fairly easy to determine. But can you say that it's the second from the top, or that it's in the middle of the corners, or how much can you actually require of the user to understand where things are placed in the physical world if you only have 4 corners? That, I think, is a really, really interesting discussion. So a couple of pass and fail examples. So the first pass example would be a physical keypad with raised keys, detectable gaps between the keys so that each key is detectable, and then the raised dot on the 5th key, or the 5 key in the middle, which is standard. So that would be a pass. Another pass would be raised indicators on the frame corresponding to on-screen button positions. So, and I think this is when you have like an ATM where you have the buttons on the side, and you can either push on the screen or on the frame adjacent to it. Fail example is if you have a flat glass terminal, printed bordered only, and no physical reference points anywhere. That would, of course, be a fail. That doesn't really help anyone if you can't see where the buttons are. And another fail example would be a large touchscreen kiosk where the button positions change between screens and nothing is physically detectable. So that is, of course, also extremely confusing, I think, for many of us when the button position changes. So that's maybe more of a UX UI issue as well as an accessibility problem. So let's see if we have any questions and if I can respond to them. Otherwise, I will just bring them to Malin and ask her to respond to this afterwards instead. So voiceover on iPhones seem to work okay. Does this fail? Well, voiceover on iPhones, voiceover is audio, right? So that's not really the same thing as being tactilely discernible. But of course, voiceover on iPhones or the equivalent in other smartphones will definitely be useful and hopefully solving all the issues for people who cannot see, but it's not tactile. So it's not really the same thing, I think. Okay. Yeah, and Agatha is pointing out what I already said, that you need to locate it without activating the functionality, and that was part of the presentation already. So, okay, so let's move on to the next one, which is 11.5.2.1, platform interoperability with assistive technologies, another super long one.
All right. Thank you, Susanna. So yeah, this is part of the chapter on interoperability with keyboards and assistive technology. That's good to know. So if we look closer to the requirement, it says where ICT is or includes platform software, the platform software shall provide a set of documented platform accessibility services that cover any user interface concept corresponding to clauses 11.5.2.5 to number 17, supported within the platform software. And yeah, that's where it gets interesting, because those clauses are a whole world on themselves. There are two notes, there are actually four notes for the requirement, which are not in the slides. I'll make sure that those are in for the final version. I'll read out two of those notes because those are or might be important. So the first one is, depending on the platform, the documented platform accessibility services addressed in this clause may be referred to by different names, such as accessibility services or accessibility API. And the second note is that some platforms include services for user interface development that provide accessibility support by default. For example, the service for creating a new user interface element provides a role, state, boundary, name, and description. These services are considered to be part of the services provided to meet this clause. So if we look closer to those clauses, there's a whole list of them, and it's pretty comparable to the list of tests that are in WCAG as well. So it's on the first one, number 5, is on object information of interface elements. So that pretty much compares to name or role of the elements. Then there's one on rows and columns and headers in tabular data. Then you've got one on values of interface elements. So for example, sliders or circles that you can input to. The label relationships, for example, in forms, parent-child relationships between different elements on the screen, text in content or with attributes, a list of available actions, and then the execution of those available actions, tracking or focus and tracking of focus and selection of attributes, and then the modification of those, change notifications to give back to the user, and modifications of values and text. So this in itself is a whole list of requirements that you need to test, and that's quite the difficult part for this for this um, uh, for this requirement. So who is this important for? Well, actually, all user groups, because all user groups might have something to do with this interface in keyboard context, or the context of which assistive technology will replace that keyboard. So if we look closer to what the problem is, well, for web, you have a browser and hopefully a usable accessibility tree which you can inspect in the browser. And for terminals, the difficult thing is that you have no baseline of what you can inspect through some sort of interface. So there's no definition of those APIs yet. And that's pretty much comparable to testing of native apps on mobile devices for now. So you can't directly input what's happening on the screen. So it comes down to a feel or an understanding or an expectation rather than a binary value that you can test. So the conclusion of the group was that we need more test scenarios for these clauses to be able to make sure that this requirement can be tested. So we didn't come to a conclusion on pass and fail examples for this specific requirement, unfortunately. But we do feel that there's quite a lot of work to do on this specific requirement. Any questions?
Yes, thank you. And I promised that you would say your name, so I don't have to say your name in the wrong way.
Oh yeah, yeah. It's Jeroen Hulscher.
Yeah, easy for everyone except me.
Yeah.
So,
Well, yeah. Thanks for that.
okay, do we have any questions on this group or this report? I do not see any questions. We got a question earlier that I cannot respond to, but maybe somebody else can. So how is the X height defined for writing systems other than the Latin alphabet? Maybe someone in our distinguished panel or in the group. Yeah, Shadi is on camera, so probably he knows everything.
No, but that's a good question. Yeah, I did mention that, but that's one of the issues. It's very Latin script focused. And by the way, there's a similar discussion happening in the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines Working Group on other aspects of internationalization. So that's a common problem that when we start to expand these to other languages, that we start finding issues.
Okay, so now we actually have a question for this. Thank you, Shadi, for going back. So now I see there is a lot of overlap with WCAG criteria, correct?
Yeah, that was the conclusion of our group as well. So there's a large overlap with 1.3.1 in WCAG and 4.1.2, I think. Yeah. Yeah, that was the conclusion of the group as well. Yep.
And did you discuss what that means, or if that is a
well, I think we can learn a lot from the test examples in WCAG on how to test this in the interface of a terminal, for example. But then there's still the difficulty of not having the same interface level. So there's something that we need to come up with to define that.
Yep. Okay, I am kind of hoping a little bit for the Norwegian examples of, because they have been testing self-service terminals for many years because they have legislation on it for a long time, and I know that they're currently updating their test methodology. They are sharing everything online, so I hope that in a while there will be more at least inspiration for this, even if that doesn't mean that that is the only way or the right way to do it. But still, there's usually a lot of good information there. So hopefully we can add that discussion into our next workshop. So we got a new question again. That's good. They're coming in as we just keep talking. So actually, I couldn't understand why we need 11.5.2. If we pass all the WCAG criteria, can't we pass all the 11.5.2 criteria?
Yeah, I love that thinking, except for the fact that we can't compare it on the same interface level. So we need something that defines more specifically how to test for interfaces without the accessibility tree.
Thank you. And Detlef, you can't wait until it's your turn. I can see that. So please.
Now you've confused me, and I forgot what I wanted to say. No, sorry. I just thought that first of all, and we get to that, there are some of these requirements that Jeroen mentioned that are new, that are not covered by WCAG yet. So they have a purpose. Some of them are redundant, others aren't. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, I think this the whole set of 11.5.2.5 to 17 is really covering things where you have an accessibility API. So it is really for things that are not closed systems. And to see, so the current self-service terminals are normally closed systems, but obviously it's good and future-proof if this is included and also applied to self-service terminals where they are open or where they are becoming open. So it's well possible that an open self-service terminal could run things like a screen reader. And even though that's not the case right now, it's good to have requirements that would cover that. And for that, I think this requirement is mainly for.
Yeah, thank you. Jeroen, would you wanted to?
No, I just wanted to thank Detlef for adding that, because that's indeed correct. Yeah.
Yeah, and there is oh, look, somebody knew what the X height seems to exist in Arabic typography. So thank you for for adding that in the chat. So we have discussed also that for some of the requirements that we haven't really touched yet, the facilitators right now and the people that we normally get on our on these workshops do not have maybe all the competences or experiences. For example, there are some specifications on acoustics and audio things that none of us really know much about. So we are thinking of, when we're moving forward, that we are also inviting specific experts into those groups to make sure that we are that we can cover all of these things. But the more we look into the details of this, the more doors we open, and the more specific specialities or special competencies and knowledges are needed. So yes, thank you, Jeroen, more or less, for this, and thank you very much also for being with us on this workshop. It was your first as a facilitator, so thank you very much for coming all the way to rainy Dublin with us, and also for being here today and doing the presentation.
Glad to be help.
So let's now move on to today's last requirement, 11.5.2.11, list of available actions. Detlef.
Yes, list of available actions. We've Jeroen just mentioned this set of requirements, and this is one of them. And it's also one of them where arguably there is something extra which is added, which is not yet in WCAG. So let's see. Let's look at the requirement itself. I've basically extracted something that I think is understandable because the requirement is worded in such a way that I think no one would understand it on the first or even on the second reading, and we don't want to waste time on it. So I have made the decision not to read it out fully, but to read out the simplified version, which I think contains the meat of the requirement. If anyone wants it to be read out, then please raise your hand or insist. Otherwise, I'll just plow on. So the meat of the requirement is that available actions that can be executed on a user interface element are programmatically determinable by assistive technologies. So this applies to functionality that is not closed. So it wouldn't apply to the typical self-service terminal or kiosk system where you have no way of running your own assistive technology, your own screen reader or your own switch device or whatever, because it's simply not there. The only thing you can do is plug in a headphone and get an audio output. And that thing would not, an audio output of the things you see on screen with instructions what to do would not count as open functionality. So it wouldn't really be covered by, it wouldn't really apply, this requirement wouldn't really apply to that. So where it does apply is, for example, in mobile apps, native mobile apps. So that's why I've taken out an example from a mobile app. It's basically, you see on the screen of a mobile transport app where you can put in your location and the destination, and you get some transport service suggested. And that transport service is something like a tile where you have lots of information in one element. It's the departure time. It's where you depart, where you want to go to. It tells you how long you take to get there. It tells you how long the service will run. It also gives you the price, and it gives you additional information on current construction work on the service. So you have quite a few things in there. And the interesting thing is that for screen reader users, so people who use the auditory output, it's quite convenient to focus this on one focus stop. So if you're a screen reader user and you move through those transport services, you don't have to have a focus on each and every of these elements. You can just go to the next service because you may want a later one, for example. And if you want to know more, you can then inquire it. And this is a point where actions come in, because you can now say, for example, on this element, when you focus it, you get at the end the announcement actions available. And if you swipe up or down, you get the actions that have been defined on this element spoken. So you could, for example, say buy ticket or show construction work or activate. And activate would simply go to a detailed view. If you move on to the next slide. So who is this important for? It's certainly important for people without vision. So I just said a blind user using a screen reader needs a way of those actions that is available to them. So on the example before, you saw there's a focus on that one tile, and if you're not able to activate or to focus the individual elements within that tile, they would not be available to you, even if they're available for a touch user. The touch user, for example, could simply tap on the little price in this tile and would go straight to buying the ticket. Or he could touch, or she could touch on the construction notifications, and you would then end up on a screen telling them the building works on that service. But for someone who focuses this on one focus stop, that's not possible. So it's very important for those blind users who need to have a way of getting a list of these actions and to be able to select and activate them. But it's also important for people with limited manipulation or with a limited reach. For example, people who with these motor disabilities often use switch assistive technology. And on the screen to the right, you see now this same tile, and you see someone who has turned on the switch service in his assistive technology settings will then get those same actions as a list of actions he can then or she can then select and activate. So it's not only for screen reader users, it's also for example, for users of switch services. And it may also be available to keyboard users in another way where you get a context menu maybe, but that's something which is unlikely to be implemented in an app used primarily without a keyboard or only with a virtual keyboard. So there's other usages which are listed, like users with limited cognition. I'm not entirely sure why. Maybe it's relevant. I mean, so one thing we discussed, which is an overall interesting thing, which we discussed in the workshop, is what exactly is an action? Because in some ways, an action is the same as a function or a functionality, but there was some confusion in the workshop whether it may apply to system actions. And you see, for example, in this screen, there's a system action swipe down. So you can activate that action and it would basically scroll the view down. And that's something which the switch service has added. Basically, it's not an action which is defined by the developer or the author of the service, but which is added by the system. So there's the question was in the discussion in the workshop, do we need, someone suggested it should better be called functions listed are available rather than actions. So whether that is the right solution, I'm not entirely sure. I'm just mentioning that there was some confusion between custom functions, custom actions, and system actions. Right. Can you move on? So the problems we had is that in checking whether all the things that other users can do on a screen are also available to, for example, to screen reader users who want actions, would be to check what else is available here. So you need to check, for example, if you can tap on things to get to other screens or execute functions. Are these things also available either as actions or in another way, either directly that you can focus it or on some screen that follows after activation, basically after carrying out the default action. In the case of the transport service, you may get to a screen with more details on the transport service where you can then buy a ticket or get information on construction work. So that would probably meet the requirement, but we weren't entirely sure about that. So this comparison is I think, a core thing, and it's maybe not quite easy to understand what is available to all users, to touch users, to people via the actions, and how you would assess that. Because actions may be available on the next step, it's also the question, what is if actions are redundant, and would that be a failure? Probably not, but it would not be good design, obviously, if the actions that the developer has defined do the same thing as the default action does anyway. So the other difficult thing is also that the actions are only available, or many actions are only available when you're running specific technology. So a touch user would not see these actions necessarily. The screen reader user would hear actions available and then get them read out, or the switch user would get them listed. But it's something that where you have to delve in a little bit. That also relates to the testing, I guess. And also one thing that's related is the next the next requirement in this list of requirements, which is execution of available actions. Is certainly not enough to just list it. You also have to be able to execute it, but that is covered by another requirement in the set of requirements. So if you move on, we end with pass-fail examples. A pass would certainly be all actions available for pointer, such as mouse and touch users, are also available for assistive technology users, either directly or via a list of actions announced by actions available. So that would be a pass. And as I said, there can be redundancy. That would not be a failure if there's redundancy, but obviously it's better designed to try to make it so that the actions cover something that's not already covered by things on the screen. And the failure would be several interactive elements available for pointer users are grouped to one single assistive technology focus point. We've seen that in this example of the service. But one or more of the actions in this group are not available in a list of actions and also not available in any other way. So if you had an action which does something specific, then that would be a failure if that's not also available in some other way. And the other way around, if you focus an element and there are no actions, and you can't focus the things within this element, then that's also a failure because the screen reader user would have no way of getting to this thing because all these actions are read out together when you focus the element. So I hope that is clear. It's a bit complex. It's one of the more complex requirements, certainly, and it needs, I think, testing with the screen reader running. So to get to these actions and see whether they cover all things that are also available to other users. I hope that was clear, and I think I'm done, and I'm waiting for questions.
Thank you, Ditlev. It's because it was the most complicated one that you got that requirement, because you can untangle complicated things. So thank you very much
Thanks
for
a
the
lot.
presentation, or maybe making them even more complicated sometimes. So let's see if we have any questions on this. And I did put the full requirement in the chat because you did show it online. So if it kind of shows, you need to have it in text as well. So I'm fine with you not reading it, but I put it in the chat
Okay.
if
Yeah.
anyone wanted it, because it was in very small text. So do we have any questions for Ditlev? Show us that you are alive and interested in this complex thing. So I will respond to another question that is more general in the meantime while people write up their questions. So is the new version of the EN 301549 still expected to be published in July? It feels like there are a lot of questions or open issues still. Well, that's a difficult or an interesting question. Well, first of all, what we present here that we think are not yet clear or so on, that has today, unfortunately, nothing to do with the standardization process, because there is already a draft that is going to be voted on. So we can no longer really input or impact in a good way this standard. So there's kind of a different thing. So what we are doing is something outside of the standardization process. But we have meetings in the joint technical body in March discussing the current draft, and then if everything goes as we hope, then there will be a voting process. And I personally do not think July is feasible, no, but I hope that we will have something published in the official journal this year. I would assume after the summer, but it's still, there's a lot of, even if things go well in the groups, then still the voting process can take a lot of time because it's a 3-logo standard and so on. So the formal parts of this may take longer than anyone wishes. And then we have another general question. I have a question, but not about the standards. How can we reach previous workshop recordings? So we do not record these workshops. They are not hybrid. Which is not really true, because once we did have a hybrid one, so that one is recorded. I'll make sure, Peter, if you have a better memory than me, can you please write down that we should list that also in the thank you email? So we have the recording for the one we did do online, and then also the documentation. So everyone that was registered for this webinar will get the recording of this webinar, and you will also get the written documentation of kind of the results from the workshop breakout groups. And from one of the workshops that we did online only last autumn, there should be a recording that you can actually listen to. But normally the workshops are on site only. So, and here comes another question, and maybe this is for Ditlev. Is there any concern about making actions available to assistive technology users with as few steps as possible? or as close to the number of steps as pointer users have. Those tiled travel options can be difficult to navigate as a pointer user. It seems like additional steps would make it very difficult.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question has two different aspects. One is how do you present actions for screen reader users? The other is focusing on pointer users. So, I mean, for the actions for screen reader users, at least what I've heard from blind colleagues is that they are normally very much in favor of having these actions and being able to focus a group of elements and then have the actions if they want them, because they can then choose to either go to the actions or move on to the next element. So that makes for them the navigation of things where you have a list of elements which you need to pick to inquire much more easy. Imagine you would have to have 3 or 4 focus stops on each of these tiles. That would make it much harder for screen reader users to go through all these travel options. So for them, it's actually quicker to know there are actions, I can call them up, and I can then pick an action rather than having to go through all these things. And I mean, for pointer users, it's obviously there is an issue of information density. Things may even be slightly too close together. I haven't measured whether target size is met here, but at least if you have the same scheme, like the price is always in the lower right corner of each transport option, I think it's a fairly easy thing to get wrap your head around and use. So it's always a question, and I think that's why you can activate these elements also on that overview. You don't need to go to the detailed view, so you reduce the number of steps by packing things closely together into that one tile. You can go to the, say, buy ticket directly, or you can go to the detail view and then select buy ticket. So it's basically built-in redundancy, which should cater both for people who want to have a closer look at the entire option, maybe with more information even, and for those who want to quickly buy a ticket and not be bothered with inspecting the details.
Okay, thank you very much. If you can have a 30 seconds respond to this, is the actions available, quote unquote, an iOS or Android functionality that can be implemented, or does it need to be defined by the developer?
I think, as far as I'm aware, I'm not a native app developer myself, but I know that both for Android and iOS, you can define actions on elements. So you can use basically platform technology to define those actions. And if you do that, then the platform will take care of making users aware of there are actions available, and will also list them and make them available through double tapping in the case of a screen reader. So it's a built-in functionality.
Okay, thank you. Perfectly timed, Ditlev. Thank you very much. So if anyone is interested in joining our next workshop, that will be in Brussels on the 22nd of September, where we normally have an anniversary of the Web Accessibility Directive, kind of a celebration that we do together with the European Commission and the European Disability Forum on the 23rd of September, which is the date when the Web Accessibility Directive was born many years ago. But this year we will make it broader than only the Web Accessibility Directive, because we now have the European Accessibility Act in place and so on. So it will be a bigger accessibility event again, and we will definitely have one of these workshops. So save the date for that if you are interested in joining us. And if you are interested in knowing anything more, or if you want to have any comments or anything, I am showing the world's longest email address on screen, so I also put it in the chat because it's really difficult to spell, at least for me. So thank you very much to our speakers today, Peter, Ditlev, Shadi, and Jeroen, and thank you for facilitating and working so much with all of this, and thank you everyone. I can see people in the audience also who were at the workshop, so thanks for joining us again. These are one of the most popular things we do in the EU, and I think we're doing something unique, and it's really, really nice to see the good discussions and the energy in the room when we have these workshops. So thank you for joining us today, and please do join us again next time we will meet to continue our quest for making the EN 301549 understandable, testable for everyone. Have a good day, everyone. Bye-bye.